like to start off by thanking everyone for coming tonight. I'm Tim Morrow, the CEO of San Antonio Zoo and Will Smith Zoo School. It's an honor for us to be here at the Argyle. I'm pretty sure it's the first time the zoo has ever been here, and to do this chat is really important for us. One of the biggest challenges the zoo has, and the best challenges, is there's so many things going on behind the scenes that people have no idea what we're doing. So we have really been going through an evolution process and becoming more focused on conservation and education. You may have heard we just opened the Will Smith Zoo School at the former Sunshine Cottage location. So when that is fully built out, it'll be the largest nature-based preschool in the country. We're very excited about that project, the biggest project in zoo's history. And then Dante and his team, Dante, Dr. Fenolio, which I call the most interesting man in the world, came to the zoo 5 years ago, 2 years before I did, and started the conservation and research department. So what zoos do across the world is a lot of conservation in the field, a lot of studying and science at the zoos. And if you combine all the zoos, the accredited zoos in the country, with the conservation efforts that they do, it's probably one of the largest conservation efforts on the planet combined. So Dante has really been building that department out for us for the last 5 years. He recently brought on another PhD, Andy, to help him, because Dante literally lives more than half his life other places other than San Antonio. So he's in caves in China 1 month, and the next month he's in Japan working with Japanese salamanders, and the next month he's on a boat in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico doing deep sea exploration. The next month he's in Peru doing work with Amazonian tribes, and then he's in Chile, and then so he is all over the world doing all sorts of things, and Andy's now helping with that. So Dante's wife, who's here, is probably very happy, or maybe not, I'm not sure, but we're glad to see Dante back at the zoo more because he's such a great spokesman. So I'd like to take this time to introduce Dr. Dante Fenolio, who leads our conservation and research department for San Antonio Zoological Society.
Thank you so much for having me tonight, and it's so great to be in front of this group. I am going to go over our conservation program tonight, and I'd like to start with a request of you all. I'd like you to imagine in your mind a special, unspoiled wild place. I'm sure everybody's got one. And think of why those places are special to you, and what makes a wild place, right? And then I want to think about the realities of how unusual or how uncommon those special places actually are. And when humans get going in the environment and we start doing our thing and altering the environment, we don't just change the circumstances for people, we change them for wildlife too. Now, one of the really common things that happens when we start changing the environment is that we immediately will connect with things that are called charismatic megafauna. And that's a fancy term for warm, fuzzy, and cute, right? So that's the first group of wildlife that we will connect with, and typically that's the first group of wildlife that we reach out to and set up conservation work for. Now, it's important to do that. Those programs are critically important, and these species are critically important, but there's something that's sort of left out of the mix when that happens. And the truth is that the vast majority of species that need our help when we've done something to the environment are not charismatic. And that's problematic. These species get lost by the wayside when we do something to the environment. And so my whole point in bringing this up tonight and starting this way is to let you all know that my department focuses on these species that otherwise would be neglected. So we are focusing a lot on non-charismatic things. Now, the zoo has plenty of really valuable programs focusing on the charismatic, the warm and the fuzzy, and things that all of us would relate to immediately. But we like to pay attention to some of these other species. So in tonight's talk, I'm going to briefly cover why I think zoos are important and some of the real strengths, the real strong suit of contemporary zoos. I think that we'll go through some coverage of the diversity and breadth of conservation programs at the San Antonio Zoo, and you will notice once I get going that there's an amphibian bias, and I'll explain to you why that bias is there. And I want to get into why amphibians serve as such a great system to better understand what's happening to wildlife across the board. Amphibians really are a good model, and we'll get into that. So the next obvious question is, how can one institution have an impact? This is a problem that's global in scope. We've got issues all around the world. How can one institution possibly get to the point where they're positively impacting this issue? I'll give you some examples of amphibian-specific projects at the zoo, and then I'm going to end with an argument that I like to hand to folks, because I realize the average person out in the public maybe isn't either environmentally aware or maybe out downright hostile towards the environment. But there are very, very good reasons that everybody should care, and I'm going to give you one of those reasons tonight. So when we talk about contemporary zoos, they're special because zoos are at this nexus. Zoos have more interface with the general public than do all of the other types of conservation organizations combined, right? And to give you an idea of that scope, there are hundreds of millions of people that visit zoos and aquariums every year, more than all of the professional sporting events in the United States combined. That's a lot of folks. So zoos are in a key position to deliver conservation messages to the public, and I think that's so important, right? So in as much, zoos have the ability to reroute monies that families set aside with the intent for entertainment and reroute that towards conservation. That is another very unique character of the contemporary zoo, and that's something that really no other conservation organization can claim. Again, inasmuch they're not competitive with the other big not-for-profit conservation organizations, because where the money comes from is fundamentally very, very different. We're collaborative with them, we're not competitive with them. Unfortunately, the last place where we have a lot of genetic diversity for some of these imperiled species are in zoos. For an increasing list of species, where you'd find the genetic diversity is in the zoo and not in the wild. So that's just a reality of where we are in the environment. Zoos also have incredibly specialized facilities and a highly trained staff. That's another character that zoos bring to the table that other conservation partners very, very infrequently have. And well-developed education programs. And I just want to use our zoo as an example. I can't tell you how proud I am every time I see our education department get out and communicate our messages, particularly our conservation messages, to the general public. This is the pathway through which we can influence the general public, and I'm just very proud of what goes on at the zoo and that whole department. Now, don't ever underestimate the long history that zoos have with conservation. For example, the American bison and the golden lion tamarin and the Keehonsie spray toad all have one thing in common. If zoos hadn't waded in to save them, they would have slipped into the pages of a book on extinction. Now think about that for a second. So the American bison would have vanished from the landscape if a zoo wouldn't have rolled its sleeves up and waded in and saved it. That's a big deal. So there's a long history here, and a lot of people don't really realize that. Again, I want to get into the diversity of conservation programs that we've got going, and I'd like to start tonight by talking about a program out in the middle of the Gulf of Mexico, and it involves the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. We are a member of a program called the Deep End Consortium. It involves over 20 different academic institutions and over 50 biologists. It's largely technical work. I won't bother getting into the environmental toxicology that's involved here tonight. But there was a really special opportunity for the zoo to get involved with education and outreach. And we all know that kids in the United States need more in the way of STEM fields, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. We know we need more of that. But where's the hook? How can we hook kids? How can we bring them in? And how can we connect them with these fields? Let me tell you something. The deep sea is the way to do it. The deep sea is loaded with bizarre biology. Let me give you some examples, because this is one of my favorite things. We have shrimp that spit out glowing clouds of fluid so that they can detract potential predators and swim the other way. You don't get better than that, right? You've got squid that look like normal squid in daylight, but if you turn the lights out, they look like a Christmas tree ornament. So there's a lot of really neat, it's called bioluminescence or natural light, and the Gulf of Mexico is loaded with it. There are even things that are related to the pill bugs in your backyard, only they're a little bit bigger. And they crawl along the ocean bottom and they look for food. And then there's the big and the toothy, right? There's lots of that in the Gulf of Mexico, really special species. And I want to share a quick story with you because this was a cool thing as I was growing up. My dad bought me an illustrated book on deep sea wildlife when I was a kid, and I looked at that thing so many times I wore the pages out. And there was a fish in there that I kept reading about, and that anglerfish, and that's what this is, had a glowing appendage on its nose so it could get things to come a little bit too close, but it had something else. It had a beard that glowed in the dark. And I remember looking at that thing, and I was a little kid, and I said, you know, someday I'm going to be a biologist, and I'm going to go see one of those. Well, I am happy to be in front of you today to say I got that moment. And out in the Gulf of Mexico, I was sitting on the ship, and we got one of these creatures. Now, let me explain this real quick. This is a female anglerfish, right? And if you look, she's got the glowing appendage out on her nose. And that's a blow up over here. This appendage is really special. It's got a whole bunch of basically apartments inside, and it has living space for bacteria that glows in the dark. So if you think about it, it's kind of cool. It's a special relationship between the fish and a bacteria. The fish isn't glowing. It's got a bacteria living inside of it that glows, and it uses that to get other things to come a little bit too close. But then comes the really cool part. This beard down here, which is blown up over here, that also glows in the dark, but in that case, the fish produces the chemical compounds that glow in the dark. This is the only fish on the planet that has independently derived two systems to glow in the dark. It just tells you how important it is to make life or make light in the dark, right? You've got this incredible system. The fish is doing one and bacteria is doing another. But it's exactly these kinds of stories that the zoo has been able to harness and bring to children to emphasize STEM fields. And what we did, we hired an animation artist. We have 15 and 20-second clips with this character we created, Squirt the Squid. And this squid shows up and he delivers these messages to kids. And then we hired all kinds of teachers to make teaching modules that are free to teachers that want to use them. And you can download them from this site. And we can educate them about the deep sea. And again, you're going to see a repetitive theme in the talk tonight. I'm going to go back to education and outreach over and over and over again. And the reason for that is, if we can't convince the general public that this is worth saving, this battle's lost. We have to be able to do this, and we have to be good at it. We have to get kids, we have to find those hooks and bring kids back to STEM fields. Again, this program has its own website, deependconsortium.org. Project number 2, to exemplify the breadth of programs. I've got my right-hand guy here tonight, Dr. Andy Glusenkamp, and he runs this project for me. Many of you remember growing up in Texas that Texas horned lizards were everywhere. You couldn't go out and miss them. And now you may have noticed they're not everywhere. As a matter of fact, there are a lot of places where they're really hard to find or they're absent altogether. I'm not going to get into the fine details of this project, but in essence, we've partnered up with private landowners, ranch owners who want to restore their ranches to what the habitat looked like before humans started altering things, modify a few things, maybe control fire ants, maybe think about feral cats and things like that. We are basically going to create a lizard factory at the San Antonio Zoo, and we're going to crank out hundreds of these things a year, and we're going to put them back into the environment. And the exciting part here is, from a biologist perspective, we get to learn how to do this. Nobody has the book on how to put horned lizards back into the environment, and it's not as easy as just dropping them on the ground and saying, have a good time, right? I mean, you need to know what you're doing to get these things to take and do well. So there's a lot of really good science involved in this, and I am so lucky to have somebody like Andy running this program. But again, the project is intended to produce a whole bunch of what you see here, little hatchling baby Texas horned lizards. We're going to turn it into a factory, and we're going to crank these things out. Example number 3, we have a whole suite of programs that involve subterranean wildlife. And in this case, several programs that involve subterranean wildlife in North America. Sometimes we're monitoring endangered or imperiled species for wildlife agencies, state wildlife agencies, or federal wildlife agencies. Sometimes we're out working in caves where there hasn't been a biological survey done, and that brings us into contact with new species. For example, this little blind cave snail is Oklahoma's first aquatic blind cave snail, and we're describing this species right now. It brings us into contact with bats. Most of you probably know bats aren't doing that well in North America right now. There's a fungal disease that's impacting the bats, and it's killing millions of them. It's a big problem. Bats do a lot for us ecologically, and they're a huge control of things like mosquitoes and other pest insects. So when we get in and we do these surveys, we take careful notes of the species that we see and unfortunately the bodies that we see on the floors of these caves. Another project involves what's called a Mexican blind cat or a blind catfish. This thing lives in an aquifer that straddles the border between Texas and Mexico. The aquifer itself is threatened. There's a big beer distillery on the Mexican side of the border, and they're taking water out a lot faster than it can be replenished naturally, and these catfish have sort of a grim future. Now, another theme you're going to hear me go back to over and over the course of this evening. Our job with this species is to develop captive husbandry and breeding protocols. That means get good at just how to keep them and how to get them to breed before they're critically endangered. And that's a big piece of what we do. You don't want to wait until you're down to the last population, the last few of anything. That's not a good time to get going. You want to get ahead of the curve. You want to learn how to keep them. You want to learn how to breed them and publish that so anybody who needs that information has it readily available. And that's exactly what we're doing with this fish. Now, education and outreach for these cave projects, sometimes we'll get involved in communicating our messages to the general public through books. I'll give you another couple examples here in a second. We are involved with some work in Southeast Asia, also subterranean wildlife. And I've got a quick story for you, and this is one of my favorite fish in the world, but it almost cost me my life photographing these guys. So I was in Thailand up on the border with Thailand and what was Burma. And this fish only lives in a couple caves right up on the border. I really wanted to see them. We got into the cave. The only way in is through the river, so I waded in neck deep. For me, that's not a very deep river, right? So I get in there, and we go about a quarter mile, half mile in. First rapids, these fish are very strange. They spend almost all their lives out of water. It's a fish, but it lives on wet rocks near waterfall areas or spray zones, and it eats bacteria off the rocks. It's a bizarre cave fish. Again, it only lives in a couple of caves. We get up to the first rapids. Sure enough, there are the fish climbing all over the rocks. We get going with the business that we have to do. And in about 5 minutes, all of a sudden it feels like I've been sucker punched in my gut, and I can't breathe. I'm breathing, but I'm not taking oxygen in. Now a couple seconds go by, and I get a little panicky, and I look over my shoulder, and one of my collaborators, who's a smoker who doesn't have great lung capacity, is passed out on the beach. He's already passed out. And I look at the other two guys, they're panicking. We grab our buddy, and we jump in the water and start heading back to the cave mouth. And what had happened is the barometric pressure outside of the cave had changed. So the cave started doing something called blowing. And the air inside the cave was rapidly leaving the cave. And what that did is it sucked a gas cloud from deep inside the cave out to where we were. And we were breathing CO2. So we were suffering from CO2 poisoning. Well, there's a lot of funny things that CO2 poisoning does to you. But one of them is it's really hard to do anything coordinated at all, including walking. So I'm neck deep in this river, and we're trying to get out, and I'm not doing a very good job of walking. And I can assure you this is one of the most challenging environments I've ever been in, and literally it got down to the point where I had to say each one of my kids' names when I took a step to make sure that I could get out. And just as fast as we got in it, we walked right out of the gas cloud, and all of us could catch our breath. We drug our buddy. It took him a good couple hours to wake up. We drug him to the cave mouth. We all laid out there and rested for a few hours. But my point in bringing this stuff up is that these field conditions can be challenging, and this is real work. And there are real risks that come with this stuff. But some of this stuff's worth fighting for. These fish will disappear if anything happens to their caves. And in my book, that's worth fighting for. And that's another theme you're going to hear throughout the evening. So another program we're involved with involves this group called the Chinese Cavefish Working Group, and it's a consortium of biologists. Our primary collaborators are biologists from the Chinese Academy of Sciences. We're busy documenting the distribution and diversity of cave fishes in China, and lo and behold, it turns out that South China has more species of cavefish than any other corner of the planet at over 120 species. That's a big deal. What's so cool about this biology is looking at what's happening environmentally in China and what's happening environmentally right here, because they're facing the same challenges that we are. They are reliant on groundwater. There's a limited amount of groundwater, and if you don't take care of your groundwater, you're going to end up in really bad shape. One of the things that makes these fish so important, if the fish are living in the groundwater and they're healthy, your groundwater is healthy and it's good for you, so they're worth paying attention to. A big part of what we do is documenting the fish in groundwater systems. So that involves taking aquatic cameras down in the subterranean waterways and photographing them where they live. And I just want to point out that National Geographic has funded this project now for 5 years in a row. And that's a big deal for National Geographic. Typically, they'll jump on a project and fund it for a year or two and then back off. They really like this and they've gotten a lot out of it. Again, education and outreach for these projects. It's a big deal for us to be able to get our message out, and it really helps when we have places like Newsweek pick up these really exciting stories and get our message out to the general public. Last example that I'm going to give you for the breadth and diversity of our programs. I got to spend the time where I was finishing high school onward working for a biologist in the Upper Amazon Basin. He took me under his wing, and he was surveying reptiles and amphibians in really remote corners of those forests. And he was taking me with him over the summer. So I was down there, a teenager, and I got to meet all kinds of indigenous folks because all the land we were working on was owned by indigenous communities. And I was able to make lifelong friendships with these people. As time's gone on, the people that were like fathers to me are now sort of retired leaders, and their sons, who I grew up with, are now the leaders of those communities. I care what happens to these people. It's personal. So one of the things that stood out to me right off the bat, conservation in the Amazon's funny. Hundreds of millions of dollars have been thrown at it, and there's very, very little to show for that. And that's not acceptable, not to me. So I sat down with the indigenous leaders and I asked, what's the deal? There's all this money that's flowed in. These forests are still getting cut down. What's the problem? And basically what they end up saying is that there are some cultural mismatches. You show up with bags of money, we're going to have a great party. Nobody will forget it, but it will all be spent inside of a week. That's not what they needed. They explained to me that help that would really help them is just a solid revenue stream. It doesn't have to be a lot of money, but regular and predictable money through time. And they said, we can do food and shelter on our own just fine. We always have, long before you guys were around. But what we really need is help when we need to seek Western medical assistance or medicines. That's when we get in a pinch. Cash is in short supply in the Amazon. So we started kicking ideas around and we developed a project, and this is a pilot project that the San Antonio Zoo spearheads. They want to have us sell their arts and crafts in our gift stores, which we do now. That functionally provides them with a predictable revenue stream. So we went to the Amazon and we set up an office in the Amazonian city of Iquitos, so they all know where to go. They all know we're going to buy these things from them. No teeth, no feathers, no things that are going to get anybody in trouble, things that are allowed to be exported, and we sell them in our gift stores. And then we wanted to really spruce it up. We wanted to do some kind of really special artwork, and I've got a video here that explains it. Let me show you how buying a piece of art helps save wildlife and support the people that allow us to do this. The San Antonio Zoo is purchasing arts and crafts from indigenous groups, exporting those from Peru, and then selling those items in our gift stores. We use a Japanese fish print artist or gyutaku artist. We cover the fish with a dye, and then we take rice paper, lay that down on the fish, and actually press that out and print the fish onto the rice paper, and those are the finished art products that we're left with. What we are focused on is providing the indigenous groups with a revenue stream that has nothing to do with oil extraction, mineral extraction, or timber harvest. We will have this artwork available in our gift stores here at the zoo so that our patrons can help support this very, very important conservation project. Securing a future for wildlife demands creative solutions, and this is certainly one of them. The key goal here, always, I never want to lose sight of it, is to make sure that we secure the stands of rainforest on the traditional lands of the indigenous groups. No other forests on the planet have this kind of wildlife. These are the most biodiverse forests in the world, and incidentally, when I use that word biodiversity or biodiverse, it means all the plants and animals that are present and all their interactions. So that's what biodiversity really means. So that's our goal. And we think that these fish prints sort of speak for themselves. This has been a really fun project, and we're working now to get them into galleries around the country. And also, again, education and outreach. The San Antonio Express News and San Antonio Magazine have been fantastic in helping us publicize this project. So, switching gears, I told you I would explain why there's such an amphibian bias, aside from the fact that I love amphibians. So, amphibians really serve as a perfect example of what's going on with wildlife in general. Amphibians suffer from almost everything that we do, whereas other groups of wildlife might not. So amphibians really sort of eclipse all of the problems. I don't want to make any assumptions. Let's talk about what amphibians are. 3 living groups of amphibians: frogs and toads, salamanders and newts. Most people know those. Then there's this third really weird group, the caecilians, right? And caecilians look like big earthworms, but they're not earthworms at all. They've got a jaw and teeth and a backbone just like we do. They're vertebrates. But they're only found in the world's tropics, and it's sort of the third mysterious group of amphibian. Now, there are over 7,000 living species of amphibians. That's a lot of wildlife, right? And we know that of those 7,000, 30 to 50% are in decline or have already vanished. So of the remaining 50%, we just don't know enough to be able to tell you how the populations are doing, and chances are most of those populations are also not going to be doing well. Many of the declines have been recorded only in the past 25 to 30 years, so this is a relatively recent phenomenon. So I want to bring the scope of this issue to you, and this is important. So if you took all of the world's endangered freshwater fish, and all of the world's endangered mammals, and all of the world's endangered birds, you still have more endangered amphibians. That's the scope of this issue, and it's a big issue. So why, then, are these things declining? Habitat alteration. With 90% of the amphibian species that are in decline, we've done something to the habitat. And that's not always obvious. What I mean by that? You can put in a road, and it can be disastrous for an amphibian population. Typically, the amphibians will live on one side of the road and breed on the other side of the road, and twice a year they've got to cross them. And that just doesn't end well. Harvest is a big deal, whether it's for food items, medicinal purposes, scientific collection, or the pet trade. That's a big issue. Exotic species are driving declines, whether serving as predators, competitors, or prey items. Ultraviolet light exposure is an issue at high elevations, whether it's ozone related. Usually it's at higher altitudes, but the evidence is not entirely conclusive with all of the examples. Acidification of the environment is not inconclusive. Acid rain changes the pH of soils. Salamanders are very pH specific. If you change the pH of their soils, they vanish. Environmental contaminants are a big problem, whether we're talking about pesticides, heavy metals, or fertilizers. That's a big problem with amphibians. Disease is another one. Most of you are probably aware that there's a fungus that's killing amphibians, but it's not just this fungus. There are viruses and there are bacteria. Almost without question, they have been moved around the globe inadvertently by humans. Now we're learning about this interactions business, and this is serious. We have these forces killing more amphibians when they combine than either would have done independently. And it's a big problem, whether we're talking about fertilizers mixing with these viruses, or climate change and that fungus happening at the same time, or things like shrinking habitat and water contamination. So these forces can interact and have a really, really serious impact on amphibian populations. So with that in mind, how is it that one small institution can make an impact? And I'm going to pitch the argument tonight that clear program focus is what's going to make a difference. And we've got 3 areas where we have clear program focus. The first one, some of these species are going to need a helping hand. They're going to need what I call protective custody. If you don't take them into captivity, they're just going to vanish in the wild. Things are too bad in the wild right now. With that in mind, we're going to need lab space. And what that means is we're going to need some sort of cost-effective way to put labs in. My team specializes in changing transoceanic shipping containers into cost-effective lab space. When I say cost-effective, this is what I mean. I can put one of these labs in fully outfitted for about $25,000. I couldn't touch permits on a building for $25,000. So this is a very functional way of doing it. It comes with all kinds of upsides. For example, they're mobile. You can throw them on a truck, you can throw them on a train, you can throw them on an oceanic ship. You can move them if you have to move them. You have to do a little bit of manipulation of the equipment that goes inside of these things. You have to set them up in a very specific way. Again, my team is trained to do this. We've got these in place now at the zoo. But once you have them, you can outfit a lab and you can have over 100 enclosures in here and you can house upwards of 500 individuals. That is a cost-effective way of getting lab space going. So this is the first pathway through which I believe we can make an impact. Pathway number 2, a strong training program. I've got this well-educated staff that knows what they're doing. They know how to breed really challenging species. It doesn't make any sense if we keep all that information bottled up and with us. We need to get it out there. We need to have really good training programs. What do I mean by training programs? Well, it's hard to read in a book how to breed a frog. It's a lot easier if you're there when we do it. Learn it hands-on, right? And so hands-on captive amphibian reproduction programs are the best way to train people how to do this. That means, how do you get frogs to breed in the first place? You may need to set up something called a rain chamber where you manipulate conditions inside to mimic rain showers and mimic humidity changes. Once you get the eggs from the frogs, what do you need to do with those eggs to make sure that they hatch out? When they're hatching out, is there anything you can do to maximize the number that hatch from the clutch? And then once you get the tadpoles, remember, 7,000 plus species of amphibians, a lot of them have larval stages. That's a lot of frogs or amphibians to figure out. They're not all going to eat the same thing. As they develop, do you need to change conditions for them at all? And once they approach metamorphosis, that's that change from a larva to an adult, is there anything special that you need to do for them? Once they change over, do the little frogs have the same requirements as the big ones, right? Then there's this business of directly developing species. They do all their development inside of an egg and just hatch out as a miniature of the adult. Do they need anything special? Pathway number 3, conservation programs built to last. And this is a big one. This is the most important one. And I'll explain what I mean through 3 examples here for you. The first example involves a project we're involved with in Japan. Japanese giant salamanders. This is an ancient salamander that lives way up in the mountains in these cold mountain streams. Beautiful salamanders. Big salamanders. So we're talking, there are specimens in collections that are over 5 feet in length. This is not a small animal. Bet you didn't know salamanders got that big. So here's the problem. In these mountain streams, there are all these dams that have been put in, and salamanders can't get around dams. And I've got a video here that'll explain this, but in essence, what I want you to be thinking about is the fact that this is a conservation program built to last because it is an agreement between 2 institutions. There is an institution in Japan that we work with, and there's the San Antonio Zoo. This is not hung on any one individual. If you want these conservation programs to last through time, we need to make sure that it is an agreement between 2 institutions and that if any one person bows out, this keeps going. Otherwise, why do any of this? It's for the wildlife, it's not for us. When you visit the San Antonio Zoo, your visit goes to support wildlife and wild places, and the Japanese giant salamander is a perfect example. The San Antonio Zoo is involved with some research biologists in Japan, and these research biologists had identified one of the problems with wild populations of Japanese giant salamanders. And the issue is that in the wild, these salamanders live in these streams up in the mountains, and these streams are on an increasing basis becoming dammed. Using special laser-triggered cameras or time-lapse photography, the biologists are able to watch what happens over the course of an evening with wild Japanese giant salamanders. And what they found out very quickly was that animals were approaching the impediment and trying to pass the dam, but they couldn't get past it. Well, in Japanese giant salamanders, if you put in an impoundment that they can't get by, you functionally divided the population into 2 isolated groups, the group above the dam and the group below the dam. And anytime you make a breeding population smaller, what you end up with is a restricted gene pool. And whenever you restrict gene pools, ultimately across many generations, that can lead to really bad things. the biologists that we're working with looked at this problem and they started asking questions about trying to solve reconnecting these isolated populations on opposite sides of a dam. And one of the ideas that they've had is coming up with what is effectively a salamander ladder, very similar to a salmon ladder, where the animals are able to use this structure to get around an impoundment. And by doing that, you would reconnect these isolated populations and you would reinitiate gene flow between all of those animals. The San Antonio Zoo is looking at implementing salamander ladders and reconnecting these isolated populations of Japanese giant salamanders. Conservation doesn't always have to be complicated or expensive. Sometimes the solutions can be straightforward and simple, and that's the case with the Japanese giant salamander. So, amphibian example number 2, and there are only 3 of them. I was sitting in my office one day and the phone rang and it was the United States Fish and Wildlife Service, and they said, "We've got a big problem. We have this salamander that's critically endangered, and it used to range across 3 states. Now there's only 1 healthy population left. And of all places, it's out in the middle of Eglin Air Force Base." And they said, "We've never cut permits for these things before, but you guys are the guys. Would you be willing to try to work on this project if we gave you permits?" And I said yes, and they said, "Oh, by the way, we can't even collect eggs without killing them. Everything's gone wrong." And I just want to share with you guys what kind of a nerd I was as a kid. I grew up in the Santa Cruz Mountains. One of my hobbies was to go out into the mountains and collect salamander eggs, see if I could hatch them. Kind of a funny, reconnect with 30 years in the future. And so, sure enough, we got out there, and the trick is you don't pick up eggs. The feds had gone out literally with spoons and tried to spoon the eggs up. That's just not going to work. So what we did is we cut divots around the eggs, and by doing that, you don't actually move the eggs themselves. You pick this entire divot up, and we had no problem getting these things past that and hatching them out. Turns out that they've got some specific nutritional requirements, and we've ironed that all out, and we were able to get these things all the way up to beautiful, healthy adults. And right now, we're working on a captive breeding system, and we've got females that are yolking up eggs, so we're really excited about this project. But I want to point out, again, example number 2, conservation projects built to last. This is an agreement between the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and the San Antonio Zoo, and this is really an important point. So if I walk outside and get hit by a Mack truck, this thing's not over. This is an institutional agreement, and you have to be thinking about this stuff. This has to be based in a situation that will last through time. Otherwise, there's just no point in doing any of this. The final example that I'll give you today is a big program that we are involved with in Chile. And I'd like to start this explanation with the forest type that is involved. If you look at this map and you look at the green areas, those green areas are where temperate rainforest existed. Temperate rainforest is just like any old rainforest, 100 inches or more of rain a year, but it's not at a tropical place, right? So the temperatures can get quite cold. Now, again, you note from the map, it was never a common habitat type in the first place. So, as you might imagine, these temperate rainforests have beautiful streams and rivers draining them. It's a gorgeous habitat, gorgeous environment. But why on earth would we spend the time focusing on frogs from these tiny little forests? Well, it turns out there are over 30 species of amphibians only found in Chile's temperate rainforests. There were only irregular conservation efforts ever applied to any of them. Disease has been detected in these wild populations that remain, and unfortunately, deforestation is on par with what happened in the United States about 100 years ago. So, we had a bunch of things working in our favor. We're working with great conservationists, great biologists, but I stacked the deck. I cheated a little bit on this one, and I did it with intent. I knew we needed a quick win. And I want to flash back to my childhood again. My dad had a company where he imported aquarium fish from all over the world. And once he told his business partners that he had a kid that liked frogs, little bags of gift frogs started showing up in the boxes of fish that would come in. So I found myself at 7 years old with a group of Darwin's frogs, and I taught myself how to breed them. Fast forward 30-something years, and Darwin's frogs are in real trouble. There were only 2 species. One's already gone extinct. The other one's gone from about half of its range. But I knew how to breed them. So when we built our labs, that was the species we started with, and sure enough, 2 months, 3 months into setting up the labs, we had baby Darwin's frogs. And we've got lots of media attention because of the early success, and that's what I was after. We've also discovered a lot of new populations of amphibians, and that fed into that media circus that was so important. When we built these labs, we made one whole wall out of glass, so we turned them into exhibits at the National Zoo of Chile in Santiago. So anybody visiting the zoo can go see what we're doing with critically endangered amphibians. Back to this business of Darwin's frogs. They are bizarre, and they have one of the strangest reproductive cycles of all animals on Earth. The male will sing from the forest floor. He's trying to attract a female that's ready to breed. If there's a female that is ready to mate, she'll approach him, and this is where it gets really weird. She kicks him in the head, she jumps up and down on him, she beats him up. And this goes on for minutes, sometimes hours. And if he's willing to put up with it, she'll lay a few eggs and she takes off. She's done. That's her entire contribution. Right.
What's weird about that?
All right, fair enough. What's weird about that? Well, the male will go ahead and fertilize the eggs, but he sticks around and he keeps his eye on those eggs. And as soon as they start hatching, he goes down to the tadpoles and he takes his hands and he scoops them up into his mouth, below his tongue, and through an opening below his tongue into his vocal sac. That's the structures males use to sing. For the next 65 to 85 days, those things develop inside of his body and turn into little frogs. And when he's done, he goes into a series of convulsions and coughs up, one at a time, fully formed little frogs. You are looking at the very first Darwin's frog that was ever born in our lab that we built at the National Zoo of Chile, sitting at the tip of my finger, to give you an idea of just how small these guys are. Again, there were 2 species. One's already gone extinct, and this one's gone from about half of its original range. This is something worth fighting for, and this is why we do what we do. So, there was one difference. You might recall I said deforestation was on par with the United States. One key difference. In the United States, we had the money and the technology to go up into steep headwater valleys and cut the forests there. They didn't have the money and the technology in Chile. So, what that means, if you're willing to rent horses and mules, and you're willing to pack in 2 or 3 days at a time, all of a sudden, you ride into a Chile that's unlike anything you've seen before. This is what Chile looked like 350 years ago before humans started altering it. And it is stunning. Take my word for it. Chile is an amazing place. On the right-hand side here, you are looking at a southern beech tree that is easily 450 years old, maybe older. And these streams are gorgeous and clean. We camp in these forest fragments, these really remote forest fragments, and we spend a lot of time looking at the little streams because that's where you find the amphibians. Lo and behold, all of the original amphibians that were in Chile are out in these forest fragments. I want to tell you something about this special little guy. This is widely considered one of the most endangered frogs on the planet. It was formerly known from just half a mile of stream. That's it. Everything else had been mowed under. But our collaborators, we got together with them, we worked in the field. You might recall I said we found new populations. We found a second species of this frog quite a distance away, and it's the second known only population of this species, and it's now being protected. When we're down there, sometimes we collect breeding stock for our lab, sometimes we just take notes on the species that are in these forest fragments, sometimes we test for disease to make sure that these populations are still healthy. But we always make sure that we clean our gear so that we are not the mechanism that moves the disease from point A to point B. Now, there's been a lot of results to date, and I don't want to bore you with them. There's one that's critically important. This set of labs is owned and operated and run by Chileans, not foreigners. Conservation projects built to last. If you want these things to last through time, you have to have local buy-in, local enthusiasm, and local support, or there's no point in doing them. And the Chileans are very, very proud of this. This program is now somewhere close to its 11th year, and we've raised over $300,000 to keep this thing going. This project also has its own website, savedarwinsfrogs.org, if you are curious. And again, the media attention is what really helped us with fundraising, and it made a big difference. So, in conclusion, I want to discuss an argument that's really important. I do this for my kids. This is my daughter with a Malagasy tomato frog. I care what happens to all of our kids and all of our grandkids. Biodiversity, the loss of biodiversity, will impact our families and future generations, and this is really, really important to think about. So we know we're sitting at the edge of a mass extinction event, and we know they've happened before, and we know that when a mass extinction event swings through, you lose somewhere between 95 and 98% of all the species that are present. The difference is that humans are driving this one. It's a little bit different, and it's really fast. So I want to give you a pragmatic argument, because I fully understand that a lot of folks out in the public don't connect with the wildlife. They don't connect freely with wild places. But it's important that we be able to sit down and discuss with them why they should care. And I'm going to give you that argument now. Humanity is losing its battle with antibiotic-resistant bacteria. I don't think that's a secret to anybody. You can't hardly open a magazine without hearing about this. The bacteria that causes the staph infection, Staphylococcus aureus, is now resistant to every antibiotic that we have, save for vancomycin. And now 15% of those infections are vancomycin resistant. Well, what does that really mean? In real world terms, that's just a whole bunch of fancy speak. What does it actually mean? My dad's best friend went into a Los Angeles area hospital with a bad case of poison oak. He got one of these infections in the hospital and he died 12 days later, and nobody could help him. And this is going to happen more and more frequently because antibiotic resistance is developing very, very quickly. Now, how on earth does that tie in to amphibians and biodiversity? Well, amphibians are kind of special. Amphibians can breathe through their skin. As long as their skin is damp, it's permeable, which means that gases and water can freely cross amphibian skin. And that's a big deal, and here's why. Primitive amphibians were the group that made the transition from the water to the land. And they did so because the gills on fish don't work out of water. And even if primitive amphibians had gills, they could still breathe through their skin, as long as they kept it moist. Well, you can imagine once they came ashore and left the water, they've got moist skin. What happens with moist skin? It's a great place for bacteria and fungi to grow, right? We all know that. The first waves of amphibians that came out of the water must have died in droves. It must have been absolute carnage. They had no defense against these fungal and bacterial infections. But over time, amphibians developed something called a granular gland, many generations and a lot of time. If you were to look at a cross-section of amphibian skin, it would look like hundreds of embedded grapes that are all contracting inside of the skin on the microscopic level. And as they contract, they exude toxins onto the outside of the amphibian. These toxins keep fungi and bacteria at bay. As a matter of fact, there are amphibian skin secretions that kill even the most resistant bacterial strains we know of. That Staph aureus infection that doesn't respond to vancomycin anymore doesn't stand a chance against these amphibian skin secretions. That's how functional these things are. Amphibians have been telling us this in their own way for a very long time. The bright colors and patterns on amphibians warn of potent skin toxins. That's why those colors are there. And in fact, if you look at the history of this, pumiliotoxin is a skin secretion that is being investigated as a cardiac stimulant. Epipidobetadine is an analgesic. Maganin is already used as an organ glue, and it's being investigated as an antibiotic. Cerulain is being investigated for intestinal ailments and pain relief, and adenoregulin is being investigated for treatment of depression and Alzheimer's disease. Now, this is wild. This frog is almost extinct. It sits in very, very rare forests in the corner of northeastern Australia. And it produces a skin toxin, a compound in that toxin, that functionally inhibits mucosal transmission of the HIV virus with 100% effectiveness. That means if you could replicate this chemical in the lab, which we cannot yet do, and you added that to some sort of gel, one person has HIV, the next doesn't, they will not share HIV. But this frog is sitting in a very precarious situation, and it is currently the only source of that chemical compound. Now, we used amphibians as an example. Take amphibians out, and you insert any old group of wildlife that you connect with. Doesn't matter. You can put birds in there. You can do deep sea wildlife. You can substitute with earthworms, or you can substitute with corals from coral reefs. exotic plants. It doesn't matter. The story is going to be the same, and those groups of wildlife are facing the same challenges. That's why we have to stand up now. It is incumbent on this generation and this point in time and these people to have this fight. This is the time we have to have this fight, and this is the fight to have. This is the good fight. And if we don't do it now, we are condemning future generations. These are the pharmaceutical treasure chests of the future. Now, I don't personally believe that wildlife has to be valuable in some context to humans to be worth keeping around. That's not my personal belief system. But I told you I was going to give you an argument for a pragmatic argument for folks that just don't connect with the environment. I cannot imagine a better one, because each and every one of us are going to have to visit a hospital sooner or later, and if we don't visit the hospital, it didn't matter anyway, right? That was the end result. But if we do have to go to the hospital, we're going to have to deal with these issues. These are places worth fighting for. I have slept for months on end at this bend in the river in a hammock, and I have listened to jaguars howling all night long. This forest is still there. We are fighting for this very tract of land. It belongs to indigenous groups. It is theirs, and it is their right to have it stay here. This is what we fight for. This is why this is important. These forests are still here. The species that inhabit them are still there. We can still do something. We can still have a positive impact. All is not lost, but we have to organize what we do and how we fight. This is the fight to fight. The animals are in these forests. We can go out and we can touch them and we can connect with them. And the species are there for us to learn from. This is the largest venomous snake in the Western Hemisphere. This is called a bushmaster. And there's all kinds of research into the venom of this species that could potentially cure things like cancer in humans. Speaking of venoms and cancer, right here in southern Texas, there is a venomous snake that produces a venom that is being investigated as a treatment for breast cancer with much promise. That's why we have to pay attention to biodiversity. This is our argument for folks who otherwise would not care. So, in covering things tonight, I hope that I've convinced you that we have boots on the ground. I hope I've made that convincing argument. I want you to know that most of our work is either grant, foundation, or donation funded. I believe that clear program direction, again, cost-effective lab space, strong training programs, and conservation programs built to last. Those three pathways are going to allow us to have an impact at a global scale rather than just a local scale. And I hope that I've convinced you that in a very self-serving manner, we need to care about what's going on. This is our generation and the next generations and how they deal with their medical problems. Our fate is attached at the hip with the fate of biodiversity. There is no way around it. This is the fight to have. Thank you so much for your time. Any questions? Yes.
What's it take to get you to put a horny toads on someone's ranch?
Well, I'll tell you what. My right-hand guy, Dr. Andy Glusenkamp, is right here in the back, and he is the gentleman to speak to because he is on top of that project and running it very effectively for me, and I couldn't thank him enough. Incidentally, I also want to point out that our VP of Education is here in case you had any questions. Stacy is right here about our education program, of which and for which I am so proud. Yes.
Yes. Which snake in Texas is promising for
The
cancer?
southern copperhead.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting.
Yep. Has a different venom, and it does an entirely different thing.
Okay.
Yes.
Is there any, Mary and I have been to Bolivia. We've been in the forest near the Amazon and then in the Amazon, and they've stripped a lot of that forest.
Yes.
How damaging is that? I mean, that's their way of dealing with ecology, I guess. They take a third of it out to plant, 2/3 is left in long lenticular strips. How is that working for? That's
That's a good question. So the question basically is, can you go into a forest, can you selectively harvest parts of the forest, I think, and expect to retain healthy chunks of forest? The sad answer to that question is we're already past that point. We're dealing with what are called forest fragments, and forest fragments are chunks of forest that are no longer connected to the next nearest chunk of forest. So whether that's good or whether that's bad, we're left fighting for what's left. What I can tell you is that there are still very large forest fragments in that area that still have all the stuff there. It's time to roll our sleeves up and have this fight. And that's what we will continue to do at the San Antonio Zoo as long as I am there.
All the one question, sorry, real quick. How about all the zoos in all the states? Could they come together and you basically you combine?
Thank you. That's a very good question. So can the zoos work together to deal with some of these problems? And they already do. Long before I was here, the San Antonio Zoo has been involved with programs that are known as SSP, or species survival programs. And the San Antonio Zoo is a huge player in these very, very special programs. Let me just give you an example with the species, the jaguar, right? So you want to be really careful when you take animals into protective custody because you've got to look at genetics. If you start with only a few animals, you don't have a really genetically diverse group, so that's not a good thing. So what you have to do is organize that across all of the zoos that are going to have jaguars and make sure that you have animals that are really unrelated and that there is a geneticist at the helm making sure that genetic diversity is maintained as best as is possible through time. And that's in fact what they do through these SSPs. And I'm really proud of our animal team and all of the projects that we're involved with. And they do an exceptional job. One person that I will highlight, I personally believe that we have the best bird curator in the world. We breed critically endangered Guam rails and Guam kingfishers, 2 more species that would have gone extinct if zoos wouldn't have rolled their sleeves up and waded in. We're so good at it that the feds will send people to our zoo to learn how to do it. So we've got some very good people on board. Yeah.
All right, Dante, thank you so much. Would you join me in thanking Dr. Dante Fenolio?